Gosh, it's a pleasure to see you all here tonight. As we know, happiness is a relative thing, and I began the day this morning in the dentist's chair, having a crown put in, and here by tonight I'm at Politics and Prose. So I'm a very happy man, having gone from one extreme to the other. So it's a special pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. And gosh, standing room only, so this is marvelous. Well, I thought I would begin by telling you a few stories about what the book is about, and skipping the big structure and simply tell you some stories about some of the people who are in this book, because in the end it's very much about real people. So what kind of book is this? It's big, it's heavy, it's you know, you may open it with a certain trepidation, but what it is a memoir, first of all. It's a little bit of a memoir of my travels in Russia. It's a memoir of the number of the people who are in the book. We've gone through 20 years together, so it's a memoir of the last 20 years since the Soviet Union fell apart. It's a history. It's a history of the oil industry, but also in parallel, it's a history of Russia these past 20 years, the initial collapse in the 1990s, and then the gradual recovery the decade after. So we end up with the Russia that we see today after this long cycle, and the Russian oil industry has gone through the same cycle. It's a biography. It's a multiple biography of a number of people, but in particular of the clan that emerged in the 1990s from the city of St. Petersburg and came to Moscow with Putin in the year 2000. And you could sum up the last 20 years of Russian history by saying that this is the revenge of St. Petersburg over Moscow, as the clans from St. Petersburg take over and are very largely, without much exaggeration, are in command. This is very much a St. Petersburg crowd, so it's a history of the emergence of that crowd. And this is the latest chapter in the 300-year rivalry between the two capitals, so it's a tale of two cities. It's a murder mystery, but I can't give you the names of the guilty ones in every case, but you can draw your own conclusions. There are some marvelous unsolved mysteries that may be unraveled someday, and most never will. It used to be said in Russia in the 1990s that you could tell if a business was profitable from the trail of bodies that led to the front door of the business involved. If there were no bodies, it wasn't worth paying attention to because it couldn't possibly be profitable. I'll leave it to your imagination why, for example, the International Red Cross was highly profitable by that measure in the 1990s in Russia. One clue is the subsidies that you could get for the import of tax-free tobacco and alcohol to benefit good causes such as the Red Cross. This was profitable and therefore of interest. It's even a science fiction story, because what we're dealing here really, when you come right down to it, is the meeting of two alien civilizations after 70 years of the Soviet period. The oil industry in particular grew up in almost complete isolation from the West, and this is virtually a unique case. We have other places where oil industries have grown up, where oil industries are run by national oil companies, but in almost every case, in fact in every case, these industries were first founded by foreigners and then were taken over. Not so in the case of Russia, where from the 1920s on, at any rate, for all practical purposes, the oil industry was homegrown and developed its own culture, its own civilization, even as the Soviet Union did, with its own language and its own culture. I sometimes like to tell my classes that the story of Russia in the 20th century is very much that of a people who decided that capitalism didn't work. So it's as though they all piled into a space capsule and took off and landed on the planet Mars and started a completely different civilization in which the market was thrown out and prices and profits and private ownership, and built that civilization and actually made it run for nearly 6, 7 decades. Not well, but it ran. And then they decided that it wasn't working particularly well, so they all piled back into their space capsule and came back to Earth, which is something remarkable. This is something Russians do every so often. They will conduct these massive social science experiments on themselves. This isn't the first time they've done it. So here they are, back on Earth again, and the oil industry suddenly faced the world oil industry. And so the book is very much how these two civilizations have come to terms with one another, which has not been easy because these past 20 years have been a time of revolution in the global oil industry. And so suddenly you land on Earth and you suddenly find yourself, at least in the oil industry, faced with a race. And the question is, how have the Russians done in that race? Talented oil people that they are, talented engineering culture that they are. That's part of the story. The book has tragic heroes and tragic anti-heroes, one of whom is in jail, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And I wanted to avoid making this the story of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and yet in the end, this man who was briefly the richest man in Russia, who ran the most successful private oil company in Russia at the time of his arrest in 2003. This man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, has been in jail now for nearly 10 years. In October 2013, he will have been in jail for 10 years, and this very much as the result of a blood match with his nemesis, Vladimir Putin. And of course, one of the big questions is, when will he get out? No one knows. But the other question is, what exactly did he do? And there has been a great deal of coverage of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and I didn't want to add to that whole literature. But what I have tried to do is to go into his company, and I've had interviews with a number of the players in that company to try to find out what was unique about that company that he built, what was unique about Yukos that enabled it to double oil production within 4 short years. How was that done? And so you'll find there's a chapter on that side of the story. And then lastly, I have to say that this is a story of guilty love, which I'll come back to if you ask me. So what's the book really about? All right, let me give you the main points here, and I'll keep this brief because the basic structure, the skeleton of the book is something that's quickly told, and it's basically an analysis. It culminates in a prediction. This industry, which is now at this moment the world's largest oil producer because the Saudis have throttled back, so the Saudis and the Russians play tag with one another. They alternate, they vie with one another over who is the world's largest oil producer. The Russians at this moment are ahead. They have moved up very slightly to very nearly the Soviet level of production. Meanwhile, the Saudis have throttled back in order to moderate the, well, why are they, as a matter of fact, why are they throttling back? We can come back to that. So anyway, there we have the Russians, who are the #1 oil producers. But they have essentially been coasting on the assets inherited from the Soviet Union, from another time and another place. And such was the wealth of what was discovered, was the wealth of what is still producing, that 60% of Russian oil production today comes from fields that were already in production at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Virtually all of Russian oil today comes from fields that were already known in Soviet times. There have been very few new discoveries that are producing today. The drama of the situation is that the inheritance is now starting to run down. And the place to look is West Siberia, which has been the producing core of the Soviet oil industry since the 1960s, has been the locomotive of this industry for half a century, and it is now in decline. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russians are running out of oil. There are phenomenal reserves, and of course I'm not even talking about natural gas, which is a whole different story. The future of Russia